Hello everyone, today we're going to be covering adding the Blockly block-based editor from Google into an application. You might not necessarily use this to write your own applications, but if you're interested in creating an educational resource where you teach people how to code, block-based editors are usually pretty cool. And I had a request to cover this, so I thought it'd be interesting to talk about today. Basically, you can drag blocks into this editor. You can then hit run and it'll run this code, let's say 3 times in this case. And as you drag the blocks in or you remove the blocks, you can see that the code over here is rearranged. So basically the person learning, whether it's you or a kid or whoever, drags these blocks in, and then as they construct this logic with these blocks, the more complicated code that powers it runs on the side. Blockly does support JS, Python, PHP, Lua, and Dart out of the box, and I think you can create other languages if you'd like. And I'll have a link to all of these documentation pages we're going to be talking about today in the video description. The other thing we're going to be using is Highlight.js for some syntax highlighting, because I think Blockly is capable of doing syntax highlighting, but it requires some additional configuration, and I'd rather just build it with Highlight.js because it's a little bit quicker. So let's go ahead and let's get started. I have my demo app here that I need to refresh. So we'll just do a Rails new. I'll call my application video. I'll do a -J for ESBuild and a -C for Bootstrap. Go ahead and run that. And then as that's running, we can talk about what we're going to be doing. So the basic idea is Highlight.js. It'll have like a CDN we can use. We can also do a Yarn add for it because we're going to be using Yarn since we're using ESBuild. The only thing it really requires is for us to import it into a stimulus controller and then set up a pre-block and a code block as HTML divs or HTML containers. Elements, I don't know, words are hard. I'm going to CD into the video and then hopefully I have a VS Code already open. I don't, so I'm going to do a code dot to make sure that I have this open. Now, in terms of actual commands we need to run from the command line, that is going to be pretty easy. We're just going to run a Rails G controller pages home, and we're going to give it a Blockly action as well, just so we have a page to go to. We can then do a Rails G stimulus, and we'll call this the Blockly controller for stimulus. That'll generate it. Now we need to do the yarn add command for Blockly and for Highlight.js. That'll add both of those as yarn packages. You could also do a npm install if you'd like. And then we're going to run a bin/dev since we're using ESBuild. That'll start up SCSS. It'll start up our node server or the listener for the JavaScript compilation changes, and then we're good to go. So I'm going to come over to the Rails app, refresh, go to localhost port 3000. Let's go to config and routes.rb because inside of the routes, we're going to want to change 2 of these routes. By default, we have the get pages and the get Blockly. We're gonna change these to the root of the application being the pages controller home action. We're gonna do a get for the Blockly page to the pages/Blockly. So now if we refresh, we can go to the home page and we can also go to /Blockly if we would like, and that'll work just fine. We're gonna close out the getting started and close out of the routes because we're done in those. We can also close the config. Let's come into app, views, pages, and the home page. In the home page, basically all we want to do is create a link to the Blockly page just so that we can separate it. We can go to Blockly and then we're pretty much done in the home page. Let's go ahead and close that. And then we can come into the Blockly page specifically. In the Blockly page, if we full screen this, we can get rid of this H1 and the P tag because we're going to replace it with just a div with some content inside of it that just explains what Blockly is. You can then refresh the page. It's centered because of this text-center class from Bootstrap, and then it just tells us what Blockly is. So that part's done. We can largely forget about it. Now for the actual contents of the tutorial. In this case, we're going to be creating a content tag. Now, if you're not familiar with how these work, I'll just go ahead and put this in here. Basically, you create some Ruby code, you create a content_tag, which will create a div. This is essentially the same thing as having a div with a ID equal to Blockly container and a data-controller equal to Blockly. And the do block is just you putting another div down here so that you can have some content inside of the div. And that's what this empty string is. It is just this content that you're putting in here. So it's a little bit different, but ultimately it doesn't matter. We're just using a content tag so that we have an excuse to say, look, I've made some cool Rails code. So we'll just do that. Now we do have some container and row construction to do here so that everything can be laid out right with Bootstrap. So we'll start with a .container, then we'll do a .row. Self-explanatory what a row is. A row has columns. This is how we align stuff across the screen. So we just give this a column if we'd like, because this is just going to be a link to generate code. This is going to be the button we click to just generate some code. We can stub this out if we'd like, and we can give it some data. And inside of this data, all we want to do is say this has an action, which we're going to bind to a click event. So when we click this link, we want to call a Blockly controller generate code action. This is the stimulus controller we generated, the Blockly thing. It is not the Rails pages controller with the Blockly action. It's not calling this code right here. Forget about this. It doesn't exist as far as you're concerned here. The other thing we want to do is give this a Blockly underscore target. This is going to allow us to, inside of our code, call like this dot Blockly or generate code target as a way to get this element by its ID. Basically the same thing, but people get really upsetty spaghetti if you don't use the stimulus version of doing a document.getElement by ID because, I don't know, reasons, I guess. To me, it really doesn't matter if you do a getElement by ID for generate code here, or if you do a stimulus version of doing it. But anyways, we have this, we might as well use it. So we'll save this, and this will give us a button on the page that we can then click. There we go. Nothing will happen though. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-I and move this over a little bit. Move this over so that we can see what's happening here. Unfortunately, there we go. It tells us we don't have this generate code method created yet, which makes sense. We just said it existed, but we didn't actually create it. We come into JavaScript applications, not applications. We come into JavaScript and we go into controllers, and the Blockly controller inside of the connected method, we can just say console.log connected. And then whenever we visit this page and that controller gets connected inside of our Blockly page right here, this controller, this connected method gets fired. Now, if we click this button, we'll still get an error because we don't have that method yet. So inside of our Blockly controller, we want to create a generate code method. This will stop that error from firing. It's just nothing will happen. So we can do a console.log and say button clicked, right? Pretty standard stuff if you've used stimulus before. So we click this and every time it says button clicked. Cool. The other thing we want to do is we can, inside of our Blockly page, we can come down here below the row for this button. You can create another row. And then inside of this row, we want to create two column-6s. So we'll do another .col-6. The left one will be our block-based editor, and the right one will be our code preview, where it generates the code and then it spits out the formatted JavaScript for us. For the left one, this is going to be for the Blockly editor. We will just come into this thing right here, and we will say, this is a content tag for a div with nothing inside of it. It has an ID set to Blockly. It has a style where the width is auto and the height is 480 pixels. Because we're breaking this up into half the page is the column, the width can be automatically determined, and the height we're just hard coding to 480 pixels. We then pass it some data where we give it another Blockly target, and we call this one container. This will just let us grab this one by its ID of container effectively. Even though its actual ID is Blockly, which is a little bit confusing, but whatever. The other thing we have to do is the actual output for our code. And in this case, what we can do is we can create another content tag, but we're going to want to start with a pre-tag. This pre-tag is going to be for our pre-formatted stuff, which basically means this is going to preserve any white space we have. So we want to make sure that when we do the content tag in here, that there is no space between the pre-tag and this content tag. Okay, so inside of this pre-tag, we just want to give it some style, which I'm going to copy over because no one wants to see me type all this out. And ideally, you would put this into a CSS class, right? So this isn't necessary. you wouldn't want to do this inside of an inline styling. But we give it a width of an auto, a height of 100%, a background color of AAA, which is like a grayish color, and a padding of 1 EM so that stuff doesn't hug the outside of the text. If we save this, come over here and refresh, it'll then yell at us for some reason or another, probably because the content tag is empty. Inside this content tag, Highlight.js wants a pre-tag wrapping a code tag. So we're going to make this a code tag. And then for this code tag, all we're really going to do is say this is a code tag with no content inside of it. And then it'll have some data again, just like the other one. We can move this one down. And I think for this, all I said was this was the Blockly target right there. And then I said that this code tag here had a class right here, a class of JavaScript. So let me grab this and replace it right here, just like that. So we'll do a comma after the brace, class of language-JavaScript, which comes from Highlight.js. Tells us it needs that class. You can save that, come over here and refresh. And now we have our gray box on the right. So this is where the code we create will be put, right? Let's now come out of here. We are done inside of this Blockly HTML page, so we can move on from it. Inside of our Blockly controller, we have a list of static targets. These are going to match those targets that we had in our Blockly page. So here we had the, where was it? The Blockly target of container, the Blockly target of code output. We just put all of those into a string here so that we have them in our list of outputs. The next thing we do is we come into our connected method, or connect method, and this is where we start doing some stuff for actually making Blockly work. First thing we do is we say this.workspace is equal to blockly.inject, which means we have to import Blockly, right? And the way we can do that is we can just say import Blockly from Blockly, and then we're good. We pass in a toolbox of this.toolbox, and we use the this.container target, which is this, comes from the targets list. .container is this container right here with the word target after it, so it knows that it's a target. This correlates to this container Blockly target right here, which is the left side of our window, right? So that gives us a little bit of a border and nothing else. Cool, we're making progress at least. After we have the workspace, we then want to add a reserved word to the JavaScript generator. The JavaScript generator is a import from, you guessed it, Blockly, where we import the JavaScript generator from Blockly/JavaScript. This is what's used to actually do the specific language. I think I have the snippet somewhere over here. So you can see for JavaScript, we import the JavaScript generator, Python is the Python one, et cetera, et cetera. And for each one, you just use that language as a prefix for the generator, and that'll allow you to convert the code over here into the code over here, effectively. Okay, so now that we have that, we can come down below the JavaScript generator, and now I guess what we want to do is create this actual toolbox, right? Now this toolbox is pretty simple. We come down below everything else, we just do this and we close it. Basically, a toolbox is going to be an object with a kind. In this case, it's called a flyout toolbox, and then it'll have some contents, which will be an array, and inside of this array will just be some objects. So we can do something like this. Now, if we come over here and we refresh, it'll tell us that these can't be empty, so we got to actually put stuff in here, unfortunately. As for what goes in each of these, it's pretty self-explanatory. We'll start by doing a block with a variables get, and then we'll do another block, which will be a, let me hit enter here and enter here. This will be a block for variables set. So what does that do? If we come over here and we refresh, we now have the ability to set an item and the ability to get an item. Unfortunately, we only have one item because we can only have one variable with this setup. So let's say we want to rename this to test. Then every time we drag another one of these in, it'll be named test. If we want to come down here and like rename this to counter, you'll see that all of these will change to the word counter. So we need a way to give the user more variables, basically. To do that, it's not terribly difficult. We can come up to the top, and inside of our connected method right here, we can create a this.createVariables for workspace method. So if we come down below, we can create that function real quick, or that method, And then basically what we do is we create a array of strings, call it create variables, call it whatever you want to. I called it create variables. And then I say I want a counter variable, a times to run, and a words to print. We then do a for each loop on this create variables thing. And what we do is, it's suggesting something, which is going to call blockly.variables.create variable, and it'll pass in a bunch of stuff. But that's a bit more advanced than what I'm interested in doing here. So instead what I do is I just say, look, just create 3 variables for me. That'd be super cool if you could do that. And then we just create each of these by the variable name. If we come in here now and we refresh and we clean up our code a bit, it seems like it's upset about something. Variable name is not defined. This needs to be variable name. There we go. You can then come in here and refresh again. And now if we grab the set and the item, if we change this, we can now select all of those variables we created. We still have the item variable, but these are the ones we have now. Cool. Next thing I want to do is come down here and we're going to add a couple more items to this list. We're going to add, I'm just going to drag them all in and then I'll talk to you about what they do. We have the variable set. We then have a block for the if statement. We have one for the for loop. We have one for the logic compare. So this is your greater than, less than, or equals. We have one for math number, which is just adding 2 numbers or subtracting them. Or no, this is for just creating a constant number. This one, the math arithmetic, is for doing basic arithmetic. The text is a empty string, and the text print does an alert to the screen. So if we come over here and refresh, I'll show you what I mean. We have the if loop, or the if statement, which is this controls if. We have the repeat, which is a for loop. So we can say repeat this 3 times. And this logic compare is this comparison where you can say, I want to check if, x is less than 3 or whatever, and then you just drag in a couple of these and you're good to go. We also have the number, which are these constants we've been using. We have the block text, which is just a string. And then we have the option to print that string, which is just going to create an alert. So that's what all of these little blocks do. There's plenty of others. You can go look at the Blockly documentation for those. But this is the ones we're going to be using for now because it gives us a place to start effectively. Well, next what we want to do is actually generate the code. So let's come into the generate code method down here. And when we click this, we want to say that this .code is equal to JavaScript generator.workspace to code this .workspace. Basically what we're doing is we're grabbing whatever's inside of our workspace, which is this thing right here. We call a JavaScript generator on it, so it converts whatever's in there, those blocks, to some code, and it stores it in a variable. Cool, so we now have our code as some text. Now it's telling us, hey, could you do the output right here? What I want to do instead is create a try block with a catch block after it. This will have an exception, which we'll call E. And then if this doesn't work, we'll do a console.error where we print out the exception. But assuming it does work, first thing I want to do is just do a console.log for this .code. Come over here, refresh the page. I'm going to drag in a if statement and a for loop and hit generate. And down here we can see, hopefully, that when I click generate, it prints out a if false and a var for a empty for loop, right? So it's already generating the code. We just need to put it in here somehow. Cool. What we want to do for that is just call this .update code so that we can put all of this inside of one neat little function. We'll create that real quick. We'll say this update code thing can go right here, I guess. In here, what we want to do is instead of just calling this .code inside of our generate code function, we want to do it up here because we're going to be using this in a couple different places. One when we click the button and one whenever we automatically change it. So we'll have it right here. And then what we want to do is say, this is going to be where the Highlight.js comes in, this .code_output target, which is coming from our static list of targets up here, code output. And we want to say this .inner HTML is equal to HLJS.highlight. And then we need to import our HLJS, right? So we'll come up here and say import HLJS from Highlight.js. And then inside of this highlight, what we want to do is pass in this .code, comma, and then a set of braces where we can just say language is JavaScript in this case. And then after we do this, at the bottom here, we want to call .value, so we can get the actual value of the stuff being generated here. Unfortunately, if we save this, come over here and refresh and drag in a repeat and an if block again, hit generate, it gets generated for a second. It also gets refreshed. So how do we stop it from like refreshing whenever we click generate? Well, easy enough. Basically, we just pass in an event into the generate code event, and then we say this needs to event.prevent default. Save that, come over here and refresh. And now we are passing in an event, and we no longer refresh when we do it. We're just not getting any syntax highlighting. Why is that? We come over to Highlight.js, and we go to, I think, the get link. Effectively, you have a CDN, which has your style sheet in it, but we aren't including it. Now you can pre-compile your assets, but the easier solution is to just grab that CDN link, paste it in the top here into your blockly.html.erb, which will give you access to that CSS file. And now if you do an if and a repeat, you now get some syntax highlighting from there. So that's pretty cool. The thing is, you want to make sure you're using the right language for whatever you're doing. And in this case, I think we have it set to JavaScript, so we should be good. So we're now getting some syntax highlighting. That's pretty neat. The only other thing I want to do is, let's say I drag in another for loop. I want this to automatically update, because if we look at Blockly's editor, if I drag in like a create text block and I put it down here, maybe, they aren't automatically generating it, I think. If I drag this off, oh, they are automatically generating. Okay, cool. So I want to have it do exactly that, right? So if I grab this and remove it, I want that to happen in real time. If I grab this and remove it, it doesn't happen in real time. That's why we put everything into this update code event, because then at the start here inside of our connect method, we can come in and we can say, I want to do a this.workspace.add change listener, and we'll pass in this.update code.bind, and then we pass in this so that it has access to this inside of our update code method. We pass in that context, and now it can do all of the stuff to the object itself that's being called from. You can save this, come over here, and now if we drag something in, you'll see that we're automatically having the code appear in this window. Okay, so that is it. We now have a Blockly editor. I believe I've covered everything I set out to cover here, but if you want this to, let's say, arbitrarily execute this code, so you want it to do the thing where, like over here, it runs the code, what you can do is, instead of doing this .update code, you can then also do a eval for this .code. Come over here, refresh the page. Let's now try to do a for loop. Let's create two variables. Let me actually full screen this. We'll create two variables. One will be a counter. We'll set that equal to 0. We'll create another one. That'll be a counter. We'll set this equal to 3. This will be our times to run. We want to do a for loop for the number of times to run. And then for each of these times to run, we want to print some text that says I ran. And then if we click the generate code button, it'll generate it down here, but it'll also do the eval. So if you wanted to just make it run code, you would only have that eval button, and then it would run the code in the web page, which is useful if you have something like, basically you could run the code and it would just try to move the thing over to the end here. So you would just want it to move twice, right? So now it moves twice and makes it to the end. You can go to the next level and it just generates the code. So you get the idea. So if you want that to work, you would just stop this from saying generate code. It would instead just say like run code if that's what you want. So we can come in here, wherever this link to is, which is going to be in here, I believe. You change this from generate code to run code. You then change this to run code, I guess, right? Run code. The Blockly target is going to be run code. We come in here. We have to change this to run code. We then have the run code function. The run code function will then only call the eval for this .code. Come over here, refresh. Now we repeat this. And for each of these, we do a print. We say, let's do this 3 times and let's print out evaluated, right? We hit run code. It evaluates it once, twice, 3 times, and you're good to go. So there you go. That is effectively the workflow for something like this. You would then have to create, different controllers and stuff depending on the page and which variables you want users to have. But hopefully this is a completely functional demo for you to go forth and learn people with. So yeah, hopefully this was interesting. Hopefully this was helpful. Thank you to whoever left the suggestion that I cover this on a previous video. I don't recall who did, but yeah, thank you. Hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.